Bonjour. Alors, à titre de secrétaire général de HEC Montréal, c'est un plaisir pour moi de vous présenter cette table ronde organisée en collaboration avec notre institution HEC Montréal sur le thème de l'avenir du commerce international et des chaînes de valeur mondiales. Notre économie a été fortement touchée par les défis de la pandémie du COVID-19, les conflits internationaux, l'inflation et les effets dus au changement climatique qui ont modifié la façon dont nous concevons et opérons les chaînes d'approvisionnement et le commerce mondial. Dans ce contexte géopolitique instable, comment les chaînes d'approvisionnement sont-elles mises en place? Comment l'émergence de normes mondiales sur la durabilité affectera-t-elle l'organisation des chaînes de valeur mondiales? Et finalement, comment le commerce international va-t-il évoluer au sein d'un contexte économique en pleine mutation? Nous voyons depuis ce matin à quel point les solutions sont en place et elles devront l'être encore de manière plus rapide. Alors, notre panel cet après-midi est animé par Assche, professeur titulaire au département d'affaires internationales à HEC Montréal et rédacteur en chef du Journal of International Business Policy. Il est également directeur de l'Institut international de diplomatie économique, fellow en résidence au C.D. Howe Institute, ainsi que chercheur principal au Centre interuniversitaire de recherche en analyse des organisations. Assche sera accompagné par 3 spécialistes aux expertises complémentaires. Je laisserai le soin à Harry, à qui je cède la parole dès maintenant, de vous les présenter. Bonne discussion.
Merci Johanne pour votre introduction. So welcome all to this session on global supply chains and trade. It's great to see so many people here. In 2022, supply chains made the list of banished words from Lake Superior State University. And this, of course, is not a surprise because we've been hearing about supply chains everywhere in the news in the last couple of years. First of all, during the pandemic, we very rapidly got exposed to lots of supply chain shortages, sometimes in very banal products like toilet paper, bicycles, but sometimes also very strategic products like N95 masks, vaccines, semiconductors, etc. Adding to this, what we also saw since the pandemic is that we've been paying more attention to how global supply chains are organized, and within these global supply chains, there's a lot of things that we perhaps would not want to like to see. We found out that in a lot of the gloves that we use in hospitals, that it contained forced labor from Malaysia. We found out that when we're trying to develop electrical vehicle batteries, that it contains cobalt. This cobalt is heavily mined in Congo, where very often it occurred with very bad labor and environmental situations. And then when we started looking at the environmental footprint of these global supply chains, we started seeing that a lot of components were crossing borders many different times, and that this probably is not the best thing if we want to create a more sustainable future. So if you take all these things together, what we've seen is that around the globe, in Canada, United States, Europe, China, governments have started putting into place policies in order to better harness these global supply chains. And so we've seen policies emerging like the US Chips and Science Act, the European Commission's corporate due diligence principles, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the Inflation Reduction Act, bills against modern slavery. So we're seeing a lot of these new things occurring. And so what we want to discuss today is what these new trends and these new policies really mean for global supply chains and for international trade in general. And so understanding the impact of these trends and what they mean for global supply chains and trade requires deep thinking, and I'm really delighted to be joined by 3 leading academic and business experts to help me go through this. So Jamie Burton, sitting in the middle, is an award-winning global growth consultant and the CEO of INNoVA. And you just saw a nice video of INNoVA. It's an employment strategies firm that is a social purpose business focused on equitable employment to enhance the workplaces. Gary Gereffi, sitting on my left over here, is Emeritus Professor of Sociology and founding director of the Global Value Chain Center at Duke University. He's also one of the most recognized and influential thinker about global value chains around the globe. And Marc Gilbert, on your entire right, is Managing Director and Senior Partner at BCG, where he leads the firm's work in geopolitics and trade impact within the global advantage practice. So welcome to the three of you to this panel. A first theme I would like to discuss with the three of you is this question about resiliency and global supply chains, which again has been a really big issue in the last couple of years. So there's been a lot of questions about whether or not the shortages that we've seen is an indication that global supply chains have become too complex and that the government should be actively intervening in order to increase resiliency of these global supply chains. So the first question I'm going to ask is to Gary. So Gary, you've written several influential articles on global supply chains and resilience, and you've also given testimony on this topic to the US Senate Commerce Committee. To start off with, according to you, were global supply chains to blame for many of the shortages that we saw?
Well, thank you, Ari, and it's great to be part of such an important conversation. I think it's hard to believe that it was only a little more than 3 years ago that when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, everybody started to be overwhelmed by the supply chain shortages. We saw medical supplies were the most obvious area, but as already alluded, there's many other products that got affected. And I think at the beginning, people were very quick to say that because of these shortages, something must be wrong with the way global supply chains are organized. They're not working to get us what we need. I think in retrospect, in answer to the question, are global supply chains to blame for the shortages? The short answer is no. Because the pandemic was such an unprecedented disruption in global supply and global demand simultaneously. Industry after industry had to close down virtually overnight, and then people who were buying products weren't going to buy them. So when you think about the impact that that had, it was a global pandemic spread around the world in a few months. It happened extremely fast, and it covered almost all industries. No supply chains could be able to respond to the increased demand for certain products and the shortages of supply. However, since people have been looking at this issue quite a bit, this topic of resilience has emerged as a concept because people are now saying, what can we learn from what happened to these global supply chains? Some of them bounce back more quickly than others. Some countries seem to do better than others. And I think what we learn from this resilience concept is people have begun to unpack it in at least 3 dimensions. One dimension of resilience applies specifically to firms and how firms develop strategies for global cost minimization, and a lot of that resulted in outsourcing of production to lower cost regions of the world. Other firms had more redundancy built in. A second dimension of resilience is the structure of the industry. Some industries are highly concentrated in a handful of supplying or exporting countries. Think of the natural resource-based industries where resources are scarcely distributed. Other industries are much more diversified. But maybe the most interesting and final dimension is the country level, and especially the idea that after the pandemic really hit, national governments have elevated supply chain issues to a national security agenda item. So if we think about supply chain resilience as partly dealing with firm strategies, secondly, with how industries are organized, and third, with the national security implications, we realize that it's a much more complex issue. And I'll just give 2 quick examples to show how they interconnect. If we take a pretty simple supply chain, face masks, it was the one that at the beginning of the pandemic, I think caused the most problems because face masks were the only product that were simultaneously in high demand by medical professionals as well as the general public. And we began to see shortages in country after country. And if we say, so what caused those shortages and how did we rebound? Some of the shortages were due to export controls. Virtually all countries introduced export controls on critical medical supplies. In the case of face masks, China was the largest supplier of close to 90% of a lot of the face masks going around the world. China introduced export controls through about March. But then in April, May, June, China opened up and began to export dramatic amounts. But simultaneously, countries were saying, we can't wait. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. So countries were pushing local firms to produce domestic supplies of face masks. Seems like a simple technology, except that the filters used in face masks required a pretty high-tech, capital-intensive kind of polyene fabric that few places were able to make. I think if we look at it at the end of the day, we would end up saying, on the trade side, face masks rebounded pretty quickly. In terms of local production, scale up was difficult. Countries were looking for new firms, but the most challenging part of face mask is after the pandemic, a year later, when trade flows begin to resume, if you ask those manufacturers, are you going to keep producing face masks? They basically said no, because it's not as profitable as other items we're doing. So the connection between international trade and local production is pretty complex and shows how fast things move. The other example, being very quick, are the COVID-19 vaccines. It was an incredible case of rapid global innovation. So in the case of face masks, we had a scale-up problem. In the case of COVID-19 vaccines, we had an innovation problem. Within a year, I think the world companies responded in a way that nobody could have expected. And we had 10 different companies producing COVID-19 vaccines, but two things were important: huge government investments and a lot of international cooperation. So I think when we're talking about resilience, we have to have those things in mind. Different kind of problems, but the need for cooperation across firms, governments, and different countries that are producing these goods.
So thank you very much. And so from what I get from your remarks is that global supply chains probably were not at the source of a lot of the resiliency problems, but perhaps the fact that we had these shortages and that there was such a focus on global supply chains certainly led to policy reactions to try to deal with resiliency in certain strategic sectors. And so just a couple of examples: the US Chips and Science Act, which is really an act to try to increase the production of semiconductor chips manufacturing in the United States, was really a reaction to the high dependence of the US on imports of semiconductors from places like Taiwan, or at least manufacturing of semiconductors in Taiwan. So here was a great example of where it is happening. Another example is in the clean energy products like solar panels, electrical vehicles, wind turbines, where once you started looking more carefully at where things are being done, we started finding out that we are very dependent on certain countries like China for a lot of the processing of the minerals and other things as well, leading to new policies to create more production of critical minerals. So here actually I want to turn to Marc. So you have pointed out in your writings that due to perhaps an environment that is less friendly to trade, partially because we are dealing with geopolitics, but also dealing with these concerns about resiliency. So you've pointed out that risk management is increasingly important for companies and for people that are making decisions about companies. So first of all, why do you feel this is the case, and what actions do you propose companies should take to make their operations more resilient in a perhaps more turbulent environment?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, and it's a pleasure to be here with this esteemed panel. I'm just going to build off what you shared at the firm level, because my lens is really through the lens of our clients and folks we speak to in the industry. The word resilient is a little overused right now, but in essence, you break it down to two parts: short-term, long-term. And the short-term is really about the basics. And it comes down to inventory, and diversification of source of supply. Most CFOs don't love it because it means more cost, but it means guaranteed source of supply. And it's your ability to absorb a shock, because to be resilient, you need to be able to absorb the shock. To be able to absorb it, you need multiple sources of supply or multiple suppliers and good inventory. And inventory is not just finished goods, it's also work in progress, as we saw through the microchips. So firms have adjusted now to think resiliency in the short term to be able to absorb a shock. So they're carrying more working capital for the most part. They're slowly diversifying footprint and supply base. On a longer term, it's much more about embedding scenario type planning. And this is where risk and geopolitics have come into play. It was COVID, it was chips, and God forbid over a year and a half ago, or slightly a year ago, was Ukraine. A real shock to the world. So now folks are like, what's next? We can have conversations around what's next. It's all on everybody's mind. They need to think about scenarios and then model out these scenarios and embed that into strategic planning and capital decisions, so capital allocation decisions, so that they can plot ahead to make sure they will be resilient in the event of a shock. The most sophisticated clients we have embed analytics, yes, AI, to model out the scenarios analytically and predict the economic impact, plus, believe it or not, put in monitoring systems that these bots monitor and alert if we're heading down a certain path. Think of Taiwan. Now that's the most sophisticated. First and foremost, it's the short term, it's inventory, it's diversification of source of supply. Longer term, it's scenarios, adding on analytics to be able to model what's happening in the real world based on leading indicators. But please, I tell you, the very few that are actually in the model space is rare, and you can count it on two hands maximum. So that's kind of how our clients and how we think about it.
So just going a bit further on that, so do you perceive that companies in the future will be moving towards doing more analytics in order to prepare for geopolitics-related shocks?
Let me just, so in the last 5 years, 1 out of 10 CEO would entertain a conversations with BCG on the topic of geopolitics and trade. Today, 10 out of 10. It's in the C-suite, it's in the boardroom. Unfortunately, it's due to Ukraine, but it is what it is. Add on the dynamic with China, it's top of mind. What does that lead to? It leads to firms wanting to institutionalize the right capabilities so they can be prepared for and foresee such shocks. Firms are at different levels of sophistication, but they're certainly talking about it. The most sophisticated one have moved to analytical-based dashboards. So think of an energy company that's very dependent on emerging market nations that may be under different government models over time that could change quickly. Think of Africa. They have analytical models, they have monitoring devices, and they see it regularly to see if it's changing. In a nutshell, with the availability of data, with the bots, there will be more analytics put in place, but this is really just a result of the importance of the topic. Yeah, I hope I scratched the itch.
It's great. And so what I hear is that both in policy circles and in business circles, there is this emergence of a supply chain mindset that needs to be developed when we're thinking about business, which is certainly different from perhaps what we would have seen maybe 10 years ago.
Right.
I'd like to turn to Jamie. So Jamie, both scholars and business leaders would acknowledge that companies need to diversify their supply chain base to better deal with shocks in today's volatile geopolitical landscape. So normally when we think about diversification, as we also heard Marc pointing out, it means making sure that we're dealing with multiple sources of inputs. What you've been advocating is that beyond trying to diversify in number of suppliers, there's also a need to diversify in types of suppliers, having more diverse suppliers in your global supply chain. What do you mean with that?
It's a great question, and thanks so much for the opportunity for participating. My mind is still on analytics, so I'm going to come back to that in a little bit in the next round. But I think in this moment, it's important that in every context that you've just described, there's a human element. And when we look at the demands that we experienced during COVID, and certainly that are continuing and being exacerbated at this time by a number of different things, I think that that's the focal point that we need to understand. There are analytics that help us understand the imperative of diversity inclusion, both in the people that we work with and the suppliers that we utilize. And that just simply means that those who are underrepresented or underserved in economy get the opportunity to participate, whether that's small business or businesses led by women, businesses that are led by Indigenous or LGBTQ2+. And I think that we really need to be sure that we also remember that when we use the word diversity, only 4% of the time do we ever think about people with disabilities. So we have to genuinely connect with what is meant by that word when we use it. And I think we need to just take a moment and understand that all of us have different perspectives, whether we are influenced by these global implications and influences on everything that we do. We are all human and we have nature. And so our tendencies to react to something is usually based on fear, a lack of knowledge, a misunderstanding, misinformation. And so recognize the importance of how you perceive diversity and inclusion. And when you look at diverse suppliers, there's an imperative here to understand that without facilitating access to participate in the economy, we're not only failing others, we're actually failing ourselves. There is an economic equation to be made to ensure that you are accessing those who are most often left out. When you look at the least developed countries and those in the communities that are so often disconnected or not engaged in any way. And I think when you look at supplier diversification, you have to understand the implications of what we've seen, but also recognize that in every single global supply chain, there's a local supply chain that recognizes the imperative of people. And during COVID, so many things changed. But not everything changed. But I think almost everyone did. Our perspective changed. We became more connected to each other. We began to recognize the imperative of understanding each of our experiences. And when we look at the diversity of suppliers, I think that comes into play. It's almost like intentional breathing. We all know how to breathe. It kind of happens without us even thinking about it. But we're more intentional about it. When we actually put focus to the breath, it is incredible the difference that it makes. We feel better. Our brains actually wake up. And as someone who took on cold water swimming this winter, I can tell you that learning how to breathe is very, very important to accomplishing things that are most difficult. So what does that have to do with supplier diversification? I think we need to recognize the value. And unfortunately, at this time, when we look at those assets or those elements that are evaluated in procurement processes, this is not given a very high ranking. And there's many objectives that are actually incentivized much more than that. So what is the impetus for us to start to think differently? Well, it's going to cost us more if we don't. So I think there has to be this awareness that comes to thoughtfulness on diversity inclusion of suppliers. And we actually have to give some intention to the actions that we're doing. We require planning. We need to implement best practices. We need to recognize that there is a collective and collaborative spirit that needs to be made, because in those decisions that we are making, we are excluding if we are only thinking about the impact in our own context. I think the future of business is actually tuning into the imperative of collective and collaborative business. If you think that you are a business that can function without community, without government, without civil society, you will not be working in the future. Our generation of workers that are demanding of us a purpose at business are changing the way that business gets done. And they are requiring of us the ability and the opportunity to ensure that we are incorporating things that have value. When I go to work, I want to feel like I am part of something more than myself. I would suggest that there are many in this room who sometimes don't even think about what they did at work that day, that it's a functional role. It's a means to an end. Yeah, it pays the bills. But what else can it do? And in the context of what you're saying, when we're talking about executives and senior leadership, This is the opportunity for senior leadership. We can talk about all of the things that we know about, and I mean, it took 50 years to create what your vast knowledge base has there. It's going to take us, how long? Much longer, to be able to figure out exactly how to position these new strategies. But there are benefits. Three times the consumers will be attracted to a business that has a diverse supplier plan. They want to connect with your purpose. They are looking to spend their money with you because you are doing something that they agree with. Another statistic is that, or another outcome is that it provides you to have more inclusive sourcing. Many of the businesses that I'm talking about in diverse suppliers recognize the need to be agile, to be quick to adapt. And they are capable of doing that because their context is different. They like the challenge. And they're looking for your business, and they will absolutely meet your needs. As a small business owner for most of my life now, I can tell you that there is nothing like an agile thinker to respond and be more resilient in their recovery. And the reason is because they are used to out-of-the-box thinking. They recognize that an opportunity that looks hard just means they haven't figured out how to do it. And there is another element of understanding that comes with having to do it, i.e. there is no paycheck if you don't figure it out. And I think we lose sight of that. Small business owners don't. I think that if you look at the opportunity also for the increased market share, you will find out that there can be an elevated response that has you participating in things that speak to making a change in the economy in different ways. We talk about human trafficking. We can talk about child labor and the impacts of that. When you start looking at and procuring diverse suppliers, you recognize that you are now solving some of those challenges as well. I think if you look at Toyota, Coca-Cola, and I think Marc's is a good one. They are really good examples of demonstrating their commitment to diverse suppliers. They show you how they align it with their strategic goals. They demonstrate the outcomes. They are showing their measurements or their outputs in a way that's easily consumed. And certainly companies that begin to do that more, I think you're going to find out that they're much more attractive to the audience. And if you're wondering how you measure up, the ILO GBDN, which is the Global Business Disability Network, has a self-assessment tool for multinational executives. You can take this assessment and compare yourself country to country to see how are you measuring up amongst your peers and how well are you doing. It also gives you recommendations and suggestions on how you might adjust your procurement process to ensure that there are no barriers being built in and that everyone can participate in your process.
Thank you very much. And so these comments really are a good segue to the next theme, which is indeed the link between global supply chains and sustainability. So as I already mentioned in the beginning, as we have been starting to focus more on what is happening in global supply chains, we have started finding out that a lot of things that we thought were working quite well might not be going as well as we thought. So we all have been reading about the Rana Plaza collapse 10 years ago. We've all been reading about what is happening in the cobalt mines in Congo. And we've also been starting to read about new policies that are being developed in order to make sure that these type of things are not happening anymore. And I just want to point out that some of these policies actually are quite new, something we haven't seen before. Just to give one example, the European Commission 2 weeks ago, their decision to put into place corporate due diligence principles is quite interesting. What it means is that in the future, big European firms or firms that are selling a lot of stuff into Europe, they will be liable for human rights violations that are not only occurring within their own firm boundaries, but actually throughout their global supply chain. This is something we've not seen before. We're seeing similar types of bills being created as well in Canada on modern slavery. Other bills are going through the works as well. This is a quite different world. So I'm going to shift once again to Jamie. So your company strives to provide companies with inclusive solutions for an enhanced workforce. How have global supply chains complicated your task of providing such solutions? And so, according to you, what are the benefits of making companies responsible for human rights violations, not only within their own firm boundaries, but throughout their global supply chains?
That's a great question. Well, I think, first of all, INNoVA strives to align our clients' challenges with opportunity. We all face challenges differently, but I think it's really important to note that there's always the business imperative, and in our context, it is typically associative with the talent imperative, and recognizing there are many ways that we can attract, retain, promote, develop talent. But I think some of the strategies that we use that align with what you're asking there are very specific to elements that we can have, again, an impact on. So INNoVA can help you promote sourcing ethical supply chains. We can conduct audits and assessment to make sure that you are doing a due diligence or risk mitigation with respect to child labor laws and different levels of requirements that are pertaining to legislation, regulations, standards, and ensuring that when you do those audits and assessments, that there's the recognition as we can see your policies, your practices, some of those dynamics, but it's looking for the opportunity in implementing them. And then when you have the information, what is it that you're identifying to increase, to decrease, to apply differently? Where is the investment in continuous learning and improvement? And how does it recognize the things that you're doing, your strategic goals? I think that's one of the things that we put a lot of focus on, is ensuring that we understand exactly the demands of your market and knowing the nuances of what's happening there. Another way that we do help is identifying avenues of training and capacity building. I think one of the biggest frustrations right now in supply chains is talent. And you look at the digital supply chain, their number one challenge is finding the people to actually do that work. So I think INNoVA is really tuned into the advantages of understanding the dimensions of being able to not only identify how, but the practical elements of uplifting people in the workplace and developing that human connection or that employee engagement piece, and recognizing that there are strategies that you can do to ensure that there's health and well-being in the workplace. But I think one of the most challenging things that businesses are coming to us with is measurement. And here's where we'll go to the analytics. There are very few instances out there where it is easily identified how well you're doing. Even if you've identified your goals as it pertains to diverse suppliers, or if you have the identification of your ESGs, you might make a decision on diversity inclusion even, but you have no way of knowing what is the outcome. Is there an outcome? Is there improved productivity? Is there increased market share? Is there increased revenue? And so when we look at the models of the global supply chain, we also recognize that there's almost a trifecta happening where there is complex data points and complex data sets. And there are no comparables because there are so many variables in each community. So you start looking at analytics and you start putting them together in a formula, and you have the multitude of data sets and data points, and they grow it into data groupings, and then you recognize they're influenced by geopolitical factors and weather and education and poverty. How do you put that in such a construct that it actually tells the story of your investment or your decisions that you're making in your business? And I will tell you, I think that there is a formulaic equation to do this. It's a huge thing. We've talked about AI, we've talked about machine learning. I think it is a collective collaborative spirit. I think you need to have a formula that is a base model of data points that is founded on best practices, global best practices. I think it needs to be influenced by data points that are relevant to KPIs that are standardized across the board. And I think that there are then the variables that are influenced by the community, whether they are specific, whether education, poverty, that they come together and build out that model. And I think you can see this executed in a very good example out west in BC. There is the first Indigenous owned and led liquid natural gas project that has been 10 years in the making. They looked at the area, they innovated a solution that allowed them to access current and existing infrastructure. They've had the environment assessment, they did a partnership with a private company, they developed a strategy that not only meets the needs of the businesses, but now they're providing a product that is going to feed into the global supply chain, and specifically Asia Pacific. This is an example of applying the understanding of the context of the need, the community that it's in. This is going to lead to Indigenous reconciliation and economic growth and sustainability. And I think that that's actually the model that we'll be seeing more in the future.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to a different type of policy now for Marc. So another major EU policy that was recently adopted is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which will allow the European Union to apply fees on imported goods based on the greenhouse gas emissions generated during their production. Is this new policy a game changer, and will it reshape global value chains? What do you think?
It's a great question. It's a policy that's, in fact, no different than the Inflation Reduction Act, except it's very different in how it's applied. But it has the same intentions. And that's really to hold firms liable to their carbon footprint and to attract funds in your own home nation or region in the spirit of decarbonization. The carbon border tax is very simple. You're paying for your carbon emissions. And firms that are in Germany today, or greater European Union, think of a construction company or a car company, they're importing steel. Often enough, that steel comes from an environment where there could have been coal, or there were lax environmental regulations, and therefore could have been lower cost than the steel that comes from ThyssenKrupp down the street in Dusseldorf. What it means is tomorrow, ThyssenKrupp will benefit, and God forbid, the India or China steel mill might lose volume, and folks are waking up. If you asked me, and we modeled this out, what do you think the impact to a low-end 3 Series BMW is at an estimated carbon pricing of $140? It's $1,000 US. That's material. $1,000 US. If I do nothing today and I'm BMW, that's the incremental cost to me building out this car. Will I be able to price it to the consumer? I doubt it. Maybe in Germany. They seem to be more willing to pay for green. Certainly not in North America. So I need to do something. And they're acting. They're forcing the steel suppliers to rethink their manufacturing process, which actually benefits North America because we have more advanced, cleaner, greener minerals and steel making. And I'm using steel as an example. It covers all types of emissions. Sorry, it covers all types of inputs, whether it's steel or non-steel. So in a nutshell, Europe is ahead of the curve with this policy. It's coming in 26. Firms are responding, both local firms and foreign firms that import into the EU, to decarbonize. How it's going to work out, we still don't know. How one will manage the transparency, we still don't know. Because it's very hard to look at tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. But it is already reshaping supply chains. We know that firsthand with our clients.
So just following up on that, the European market is extremely big. Canadian market is a bit smaller. Imagine that Canada would try to put into place a similar type of policy. Would it have the same impact, or would the smaller size make it harder to be effective?
I'm not a policymaker, but the idea that Canada will put in a carbon border tax a la EU for reasons that you just described, because it's more of an exporter than an import than anything else, and not huge demand, is difficult to see feasibility. Mm-hmm. But we do have carbon pricing in Canada. And it's not the same everywhere and across, so we already are ahead of the curve. I think it's watching how the US evolves that's really going to play the game. And we already know where they're going with the Inflation Reduction Act. They're not going to put carbon pricing in, so we think, but rather create incentives to attract firms that are decarbonizing and localizing. So in a long-winded story to say, I may be wrong, but I doubt we'll have that in Canada, but we are ahead of the curve on carbon pricing, which is already a vehicle that we could use in a more aggressive way to decarbonize.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Gary. You have noted a more general trend among governments around the globe to more actively harness global value chains for both economic and non-economic purposes. And you've coined this a return of industrial policy. So how does today's industrial policy differ from that of the past? And how do you believe it will influence global value chains and trade?
Yep, big question. Interest of time, I'll focus on the US case. I mentioned at the beginning that the way resilience was being defined in terms of supply chain fragmentation raised national security issues. In June of 2021, the Biden administration published a 100-day supply chain report that focused on 4 priority industries: semiconductors, electric vehicles and batteries for electric vehicles, active ingredients of pharmaceuticals, and rare earth minerals, and said all of these are very important priorities. Then what we've seen in the end of the first 2 years of the Biden administration, 3 big acts that have been alluded to multiple times today: CHIPS and Science Act that focused largely on semiconductors, Inflation Reduction Act that's focusing very heavily on clean technologies, but especially electric vehicles and batteries, and then the bipartisan infrastructure law. Now, in the US context, that kind of industrial policy is really rare. It partly came about because of the political dynamics that the Biden administration wanted in the first 2 years, when it still had control of both the House and the Senate, to pass some big legislation. It got these through, and it's somewhere between $1.5 and $2 trillion, a huge amount of money. The question is, what's the impact of that looking forward? I think it was these legislative bills are very controversial on one level. One, because they rely very heavily on subsidies. They're subsidizing firms to come and invest in the United States. But a second reason they're controversial is because even the major trade partners of the US have complained that these look protectionist. And they're protectionist because at the beginning, for example, the bipartisan infrastructure bill said you had to buy American, meaning buy US. Now what happened and the bills were written fast, and the people that wrote the bill said, okay, we have to adjust things. So when Canada and Mexico said we can't support this buy American, they changed that infrastructure bill to say buy North American. So now Mexico, Canada are part of that. That didn't solve EU concerns over a lot of issues with electric vehicles. And so again, when pushed by the EU, the Biden administration in the implementing legislation said on electric vehicles, anybody who leases an electric vehicle can source from US friends. Those that buy an electric vehicle have to source from US or from North America. So there's a lot of flexibility. I think the couple of final points just to put that in perspective. Why has this happened the way it did? I think between the competition from China, the Ukraine war, climate change, and the political dynamics of the Biden administration trying to get stuff done in the first 2 years, there was enormous pressure to operate in terms of large scale and speed. If you're going to compete with China, you have to do it high scale, you have to do it fast, same with those other factors. I think there was also this focus on US manufacturing, bring investment into the United States. But there's big risks. One risk, oversupply. Semiconductor plants are burgeoning in the US, but if you tried to only create cutting-edge semiconductors and the technology changes in 3 years, you risk flooding the market. They're starting to think very innovatively about legacy semiconductors and retooling older factories. So I think that's important. Another risk, you don't want to undermine regional integration. I think one of the strengths of the US is precisely that it's part of North America. So US, Mexico, Canada are much stronger when they're working together. Same with the EU. And I think a third issue is risk of geopolitical conflicts. The concern that if you push these too aggressively, you risk alienating your partners. But the one takeaway I have is for all of this to be successful, it requires a lot of international cooperation between all of these countries. And I think the US, surprisingly to some, but is very open to finding ways to be flexible and bringing in more international partners in these kinds of bills.
Thank you very much. We still have about 5 minutes, and I want to focus on a last theme, which is global supply chains and economic development. The reason why I want to focus on this theme is because if I would have given a presentation on global value chains 10 years ago, it would be all about the fact that this can create tremendous economic development opportunities for some of the poorer countries around the globe. Now suddenly we're seeing a lot of countries that are trying to promote reshoring, ally shoring, friend shoring. There's a great panel on this in 2 days. But if we think about the inclusionary and exclusionary forces that this could put into place, what might be happening is that you can see some of the supply chains potentially pulling out of some of the poorest countries around the globe, least developed countries, or other countries as well. So my final question that I'm going to ask to all three of you is, let's take our focus away of what is happening in the United States or Canada. Let's not focus on what is happening in China, but let's focus on some other parts of the world. How are they looking at the policies that Western nations are putting into place? And what does this mean? And so maybe, Marc,
I'll go
could
first.
start.
No, it's a great question. And here we are sitting in North America. Three of us North American. I'll consider you a friendly North American now that you live here. And we forget the world at large. I spent about a third of my time in emerging markets. And I was in Singapore 3-4 weeks ago, which is not an emerging market, but it's a bubble in an emerging market. And we got to listen to the DM1, which is the Deputy Minister 1, essentially the top public servant, right? A non-elected leader. And he said, from where we sit, and you've got to appreciate, we are a trading nation. So if there's trade, we do well. If there's no trade, we fall apart. Number one, number two, number three issue is the dynamic of geopolitics, notably China and the US. And that's all we do. We watch that like a hawk. We watch the moves, the shifts. We watch the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, the Made in America Act, Carbon Border Adjustment Tax, because that also offends China. Because if anything happens out there, we struggle. And we're speaking on the behalf of all of Southeast Asia. And our prediction right now is that Southeast Asia stands to gain roughly $1 trillion in trade between now and 2030 because of this dynamic. So there is going to be some winning nations out of this. But they, in Southeast Asia, notably in Singapore, highly educated, highly sophisticated, are very concerned about what's happening over here. Very concerned. And it's not just US, China, it's also EU and where the EU will stand. So I think we do need to step out of our zone to realize if you're in an emerging market, you stand to gain because of this dynamic, but you stand to be offended and lose because of the policy establishment that's coming through. That's it.
Thank you very much. Jamie, a short answer?
I think that you hit it on the head. I think that there is this intensity that we need to focus on synergistic governance right now. If it isn't our problem today, it's our problem tomorrow. And to exclude means that in the moment when we need something most, it's not going to be there because we've just overlooked the fact that it is needed, and that's our job is to make sure that it's part of the solution. I have spent a long time looking at the imperative of diversity and inclusion, and I've been challenged with the notion of being exclusive by trying to be inclusive. And I find it hugely dynamically interested because it points to the thing that is what we are talking about here. And it's the perspective, whether it's of the business, of the government, of the social setting, the dynamic comes down to. And if we recognize that we have something that where we need to resolve these things collectively and have that intention together, then I think we can harness the power of diversity and inclusion. And the fact remains that if you invest in diversity and inclusion, and you are looking at just procurement alone, supplier diversity will add an additional 3.6 million for every 1 million in procurement operation costs. It is economic. Mm-hmm. It is social. It is synergistic.
Thank you very much. Gary?
Let me give a quick example that deals with Africa and the World Trade Organization. A group of supply chain academics wrote an open letter to Dr. Ngozi, the DG of the World Trade Organization, that was titled Global Value Chains for Least Developed Countries. And the premise of the letter was a lot of what the WTO has done traditionally is it's focused on trade rules, trade agreements, et cetera, but it doesn't do very much for the least developed countries in the world. And the premise of the letter was to say, if we look at a lot of natural resource products coming out of places like Africa, cocoa, coffee, cut flowers, et cetera, right now, most trade agreements are market access agreements. They're trying to get developing countries access to developed country markets. But what if you turned it around and created a set of trade incentives that prioritized creating more value added inside developing countries, especially natural resource exporters? And we submitted the letter, and I think it's continuing to be discussed. Ari's going to be going to a meeting next week, next month, and I think that's the way we need to think about it, but it raises a big challenge for the WTO. They're a multilateral organization that's traditionally been focusing on rules-based schemes, but now we're asking them to be a development agency. And whether or not they can pull that off is, I think, going to tell us a lot about the future of the multilateral trading system.
Thank you very much. This hour just fly by, so it was a very, very interesting discussion. I hope that this discussion will reverberate further into the through the conference. Please contact us if you want to talk more about this. But thank you very much, Gary, Jamie, and Marc, for being here and for entertaining us with these important insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.